The German officer didn't move. 500 men stood watching him, prisoners behind the wire, American guards along the perimeter, MPs with rifles slung and hands growing restless. The rain came down over the shattered airfield outside Weimar, tapping on steel helmets, pooling in boot prints, running in thin brown streams through the mud. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rain and, somewhere beyond the compound fence, the low diesel groan of a Third Army convoy moving east. General George S. Patton had just given the man 5 seconds. The man had not moved. His name was Oberleutnant Friedrich von Allenorf. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Wehrmacht, a 29-year soldier, and he was standing in a prisoner cage in April of 1945 with his boots in the mud and his chin in the air, and he was refusing, quietly, precisely, in front of everyone, to take 3 steps forward. Not because he had a weapon, not because he had leverage, not because there was any rational argument left in his favor, because he had rank, and rank in his understanding was the most permanent thing in the world. Patton looked at him, and the 5 seconds began. The war in Europe had 10 days left to run, though no one in the compound knew the exact number. What they knew was the feeling, the particular atmosphere of a campaign in its final hours, when the machinery of war begins to sound like machinery winding down. The artillery was still moving. The trucks were still rolling. Men were still dying on roads with names they would never remember. But something had changed in the quality of the silence between the guns. Near Weimar, Germany, the U.S. Third Army had established a prisoner collection point on the edge of a bombed Luftwaffe airfield. It was not a designed facility. It was a length of barbed wire, a hand-lettered sign, and a sergeant with a clipboard, the improvised infrastructure of a victory still in progress. Hundreds of German soldiers stood inside the wire. Most were very young. Most had their eyes on the ground. They were filthy and exhausted, and, in the way of men who have been running for weeks and have finally stopped, they were almost relieved. The fighting was over for them. Whatever came next, the camps, the paperwork, the long road home to a country that would not look the same, it was at least not this. All of them had accepted it. All of them except one. Oberleutnant Friedrich von Allenorf stood in the center of the compound as though he were waiting for a staff car. Back straight, coat buttoned, silver oak leaves polished on his collar. His monocle caught the flat gray light and held it. When the American sergeant reached him in the intake line and told him to step forward, he removed a pair of gloves from his pocket and began, very slowly, brushing mud from his sleeve. "I will not present myself," he said, loud enough for the entire compound to hear, "like a common enlisted prisoner." The sergeant sent for a colonel. The MP who jogged toward the command tents came back with something else entirely. A tent flap opened at the edge of the airfield. An officer stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, helmet tilted back, twin ivory-handled revolvers on his belt, and the American guards along the wire straightened before they were told to. The word moved down the line in a murmur. "The general's here. This is the story of what happened next. It is a story about the last 10 days of the Second World War, about a man who had spent his entire life believing that rank was real, and about the general who had to explain, in the mud of a prisoner compound, what real actually meant. It is also a story about something harder to name, the moment when a man's entire understanding of himself collides with a truth he has been outrunning for months, and what it takes to finally stop running. Nobody had planned for this place. It had arrived the way most things arrived in the final weeks of the war, out of necessity, without ceremony, hammered together from whatever was closest at hand, and a line of fence posts driven into the shoulder of a ruined Luftwaffe airfield, a length of barbed wire, a hand-painted sign that read PW Holding Area Use Third Army in black letters that the rain was already beginning to run. The field had been a functioning base 6 months ago. Now the hangars stood open to the sky, their roof lines buckled inward like the ribs of something that had stopped breathing, and the only aircraft left on the tarmac were the ones too broken to have been moved before the Americans came through. The ground between the wire perimeters had been worked into a uniform gray-brown swamp by boots and rain and the treads of vehicles that had long since passed through. Things surfaced in it at intervals: a gas mask case, a wool scarf dark with water, so one boot standing upright in the mire as though its owner had simply stepped out of it and kept walking without looking down. Nobody removed these objects. They became part of the landscape the way wreckage always does, after a while. The smell was harder to describe but impossible to mistake. Diesel and wet wool were the top notes: familiar, military, generic. But underneath, cut faintly through the cold April air, there was something else. Something sweet in the way that decay is sweet. The American guards could not have named it if asked. They simply knew it, the way men who have followed an army for 3 years come to know things without language. It was the smell of a campaign reaching its end, of a machine running out of the fuel that powers it. The guards paced the wire in pairs, rifles slung, or boots sealed in clay to the ankle. They were not cruel men. That distinction mattered, even here. They had walked from the beaches of Normandy through the hedgerows and the Winter and Bastogne and the Siegfried Line, and what the road had taken from them was not their decency but their capacity for surprise. They watched the German prisoners the way tired men watch things they have already seen, without much feeling, without judgment, with the particular patience of people who understand that the work still needs doing regardless. Inside the wire, the prisoners stood or sat in the mud in loose groups, as though they had sorted themselves by some instinct no one had articulated. Most were very young, teenagers in uniforms that fit them the way borrowed clothes fit. I pulled from classrooms and factory floors in the Reich's last frantic sweeps. Their faces had the hollowed quality of men who had been frightened for a long time and were too exhausted now even for that. Some wept quietly and without embarrassment in the way that men weep when they have stopped caring who sees. Others simply stared at the middle distance, occupying some interior place that the compound couldn't reach. A few had fallen asleep sitting upright, heads dropped against the shoulders of the men beside them. Every one of them had arrived at the same understanding. The war was over. Not officially, not yet, but in the way that matters, in the place where soldiers keep the truth they don't say out loud. It was finished. The guards knew it. The sergeant at the intake table near the gate knew it. The prisoners knew it. And all of them except one. He stood near the center of the compound, as though he were waiting for something the others could not see. Oberleutnant Friedrich von Allenorf had not sat down since they brought him through the wire. He had not removed his coat or his officer's cap or the monocle that sat in his right eye and gathered the flat April light into a single small point of brightness, the only brightness in the entire enclosure. His field gray coat was stained with 3 days of rain and retreat, but it was buttoned to the throat. The silver oak leaves on his collar had been wiped clean at some point in the last 24 hours, on some impulse no one around him could have explained. His boots were buried past the ankle in the same mud that had swallowed every other man's footwear. He didn't appear to notice, and he was 51 years old. He had entered the German military as a young man at the tail end of the First War, too late for the worst of it, early enough to carry the defeat home in his body like a stone he'd been handed and never set down. He had stayed through the years of humiliation afterward, through the disbandment and the rebuilding and the slow accumulation of purpose that the Second War had finally given shape to. Poland, France, the Eastern Front, where he had commanded men in temperatures that turned rifle oil to paste and watched the retreat from Moscow teach an entire army what the Russian winter thought of German ambition. Decorated twice, transferred once, and then, last Tuesday, but he had stood at the edge of a tree line and watched the last coherent remnant of his regiment walk toward the American wire with their hands open. None of it showed on his face. That was the discipline of 29 years. Not the absence of feeling, but the complete mastery of its surface. The young lieutenant beside him, Castle, had been with the unit for 6 weeks. He was 22 and the son of a Bavarian schoolteacher, and he was frightened with the particular clarity of a man who has finally understood the difference between the war he had been told about and the one he was actually in. He stood half a step behind von Allenorf's left shoulder, close enough to speak, far enough to have some distance from whatever was coming. "Herr Oberleutnant?" His voice was low. Perhaps it would be better if we simply cooperated." Von Allenorf did not turn his head. His eyes continued their slow movement across the enclosure, the wire, the guards, the hundreds of gray-coated men sitting in the mud. He catalogued it the way a man catalogues a room he has entered by mistake and does not intend to stay in. "They are Americans," he said, flat, final, loud enough for the prisoners nearby to hear. "Shopkeepers in uniform." Castle said nothing. Several men around them shifted quietly away, the unspoken instinct of soldiers who have learned to recognize the specific gravity of a man about to make things worse. Von Allenorf clasped his hands behind his back. He was not, by his own reasoning, being difficult. The Geneva Convention was unambiguous on the subject of officer prisoners. A rank did not dissolve at the wire. Protocols existed precisely for moments like this, so that civilization had a skeleton to hold itself upright on, even when everything else had collapsed around it. He had given 29 years to that proposition. He had given men to it, and winters, and a great portion of whatever he might otherwise have been. He was not going to surrender it because a sergeant with a clipboard pointed at the ground. Sergeant Elwood Pruett had a system, and the system worked. Name, rank, unit, weapons or intelligence materials. Hand them over now. Move to the left. He had processed 400 men since 7 that morning, and the line was still moving, and that was the job. Pruett was 28 years old and had survived the hedgerows in Normandy by being the kind of man who did not need a situation to make sense before he could function inside it. He had a clipboard, 2 MPs, and enough patience left to finish the afternoon. That was sufficient. He worked his way through the clusters of prisoners near the center of the compound. Most of them shuffled forward before he reached them, already anticipating the questions, eager to have the bureaucracy of surrender completed so the waiting could begin in earnest. Several thanked him in halting English. One pressed a folded photograph of 2 children into the hands of the nearest MP and said something in German that nobody translated but everyone understood. Then Pruett looked up from his clipboard and found a man already looking back at him. "All officer with the monocle," he said. "Step forward." Von Allenorf reached into his coat pocket. He produced a pair of leather gloves. He shook them once to straighten them and began, without hurry, without acknowledgement, to brush dried mud from his left sleeve. Pruett waited. He was, as a rule, a patient man. "I said step forward." The brushing continued. 1 stroke, 2, 3. Then von Allenorf looked up, not at Pruett, but past him, at some point on the far perimeter wire, the way a man looks at a minor problem he has decided belongs to someone else. "I will not present myself," he said in precise, accented English, "like a common enlisted prisoner." The words were not loud. That was the thing about them. They carried across the compound not because von Allenorf projected them, but because everything else went quiet to make room. The shuffling of boots, the murmur of the intake line, even the rain seemed to pause for a half-second before resuming. Castle, standing behind the colonel's left shoulder, went rigid. 3 German soldiers nearby found something absorbing to study in the mud at their feet. 2 MPs exchanged a look that required no words. Pruett stepped forward. He kept his voice even. "Pal, you are a prisoner of war. You step forward when you're told." Von Allenorf tilted his head slightly, the monocle catching gray light. He regarded Pruett with the expression of a man who has been handed an object and is trying to determine what it is. "In the German army," he said, "an officer of my rank does not answer to a sergeant." Silence. Rain on steel helmets. Somewhere beyond the ruined hangars, a single crow. Pruett looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, the way a man's voice is careful when he is choosing the simplest possible version of an obvious truth. "Buddy, the German army just lost the war." Von Allenorf's expression did not change, but something moved at the corner of his mouth. The faintest approximation of a smile, the kind that is not warmth, but its opposite. "History," he said, "will determine that." Pruett held his gaze for another beat. Then he turned to the MP on his right. "Go get the colonel." The MP jogged off toward the command tents at the edge of the field. Von Allenorf watched him go without interest, and the way a man watches traffic from a window. Then he looked back down at his sleeve and resumed brushing. Von Allenorf was not a man who waited with difficulty. Waiting, properly understood, was simply the interval between one correct action and the next. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The sergeant had overstepped. These things happened. The war had blurred lines of authority in both armies, promoted men faster than their judgment could follow, produced a generation of NCOs who confused competence with command. The correct response, when a subordinate exceeded his authority, was escalation. That was the mechanism. That was precisely why the mechanism existed. A colonel would come. Colonels understood these things. He had met American officers before, captured ones, and in the earlier years, when the tide ran the other direction. Some had been difficult, some had been dull, but a few had surprised him with their professionalism. He remembered a lieutenant colonel from somewhere in Ohio who had shared a cigarette through the wire and spent 20 minutes discussing the relative accuracy of the M1 Garand against the Gewehr 43 with the focused curiosity of a man who genuinely wanted to know. That was the nature of officers regardless of the flag they wore. Below the uniform and the language, something common. A shared grammar of rank and protocol and the understanding that certain things simply were not done. The colonel who arrived would see it clearly. There would be a brief conversation. Acknowledgement would be made. Von Allenorf would step forward in the manner appropriate to his rank. The intake would proceed, and that would be the end of it. Around him, the other prisoners had quietly widened the distance between themselves and wherever he was standing. Nobody announced this. It simply happened. The wordless adjustment of men who have developed a sense for proximity to consequences. Castle remained at his left shoulder, too uncertain to leave, too sensible to be comfortable, and had been watching the American command tents with an attention he was trying not to make obvious since the MP had jogged off across the field. "Herr Oberleutnant?" His voice was careful. "Be quiet, Castle." A pause. Then, "Sir, I think you should look at who—" "I said be quiet." Castle stopped. He pressed his mouth shut and looked back across the field. The tent flap at the edge of the airfield had snapped open in the April wind. An officer stepped out into the rain. And the American guards nearest to the tent, men who had been leaning on fence posts, shifting their weight, doing the small unconscious things that bored soldiers do when the day has been long, straightened. Not on command. Not in response to a bark or a whistle. All at once and before the man had taken 3 steps, the way soldiers straighten for exactly one kind of officer. Castle looked at the back of his colonel's head, the carefully maintained posture, the polished oak leaves, the monocle that had not moved in an hour. He said nothing more. There was nothing left to say that would do any good. He did not hurry. That was the first thing. He came across the wet field with long, unhurried strides, and in the mud that jumped against his polished boots with each step did not appear to reach him in any meaningful way. His helmet sat slightly back on his head, the strap loose. The twin revolvers at his belt, ivory handles worn smooth from years of handling, caught no light in the flat gray morning. They didn't need to. Everything about the man communicated the same thing those revolvers communicated, and it had nothing to do with the weather. The word moved ahead of him down the line of MPS like voltage through cable. The general's here. Inside the compound, the shift was immediate and involuntary. The American guards along the wire straightened before they had consciously processed why. A sergeant near the gate set down his coffee without looking at it. The two MPS who had been leaning against a fence post pushed themselves upright in the same motion, a half-second apart, like men responding to a sound only they could hear. It was not fear, exactly. It was the particular attentiveness that certain men produce in the people around them. The sense that the room has reorganized itself around a new and undeniable center. Several of the German prisoners noticed. The ones who had been in the war long enough had seen this before, in their own officers. The specific gravity of command, rank made physical and unmistakable. They took a quiet step back without discussing it. The gate opened. Patton stepped through it and kept walking. The prisoners parted ahead of him without being asked. He stopped about 10 feet from von Allenorf. I can the space between them. Two men standing in the mud of a destroyed airfield, the war 10 days from its end, went very still. He looked the German officer over, the coat carefully buttoned despite 3 days of rain, the oak leaves wiped clean, the monocle steady in its place, gathering light, the posture of a man planted in his own certainty like a fence post hammered deep. Patton had seen this before. Different faces, different compounds, different languages, but the same fundamental thing. A man who had spent so long inside the armor that he had forgotten there was a difference between the armor and himself. It was not stupidity. It was something more durable than stupidity, and considerably harder to reach. He let the silence run for a moment. Then, which one of you is the officer who thinks he's still in charge? For the first time since the standoff began, von Allenorf stepped forward. Not because he had been ordered to, because this, finally, was a conversation at the appropriate level. I am Oberleutnant Friedrich von Allenorf of the Wehrmacht. His chin came up a fraction. And I demand to be treated with the proper respect due to my rank. Rain dripped from the brim of Patton's helmet and fell between their boots. His expression did not change, but the soldiers near the perimeter, American and German alike, felt it, the particular quality of stillness that collects in the air before something inevitable arrives. Patton did not raise his voice. That was the thing that settled over the compound first. Not his presence, not his revolvers, not even the automatic deference of the guards. The quiet. Men who had followed him from Normandy to the Rhine understood the distinction. The shouting Patton was manageable, theatrical even, something you could brace against. It was this version that unsettled people, the version that went still, that let you finish your sentence and then looked at you the way a surgeon looks at a problem he has already solved in his head and is now simply executing. You expect respect, he said. Not a question, quite. I do. You're a lieutenant colonel. I am. Patton glanced at the silver oak leaves on the man's collar, a brief professional acknowledgement, then looked back up. He shifted his weight, and his boots found the mud with a soft sound. Well, Colonel, let me explain something. He turned slightly and pointed toward the horizon beyond the buckled hangars. You see that direction? Von Allenorf said nothing. That's Berlin. And my army's been moving toward it without stopping while yours has been running the other way. A few of the American guards along the wire allowed themselves a quiet smirk. The German prisoners nearest to the exchange did not move at all. You're not in the Wehrmacht anymore. You're standing in a prisoner cage run by the United States Army, and in this cage, you step forward when an American soldier tells you to. Von Allenorf absorbed it. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, still carrying that particular quality of a man who believes the architecture of the universe is arranged in his favor. I am still an officer, and the Geneva Convention guarantees you food, shelter, and medical care. Patton's tone did not rise. It simply closed, like a door being fitted into its frame. It doesn't say anything about you giving orders to my sergeants. Somewhere along the wire, a guard exhaled. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that the man beside him looked over. Von Allenorf's jaw tightened. I was not giving orders. I was insisting on proper protocol. Patton let the silence sit for a moment. Not for effect. Simply because what he was about to say did not require decoration. Then, very quietly, you know what I see? Von Allenorf waited. I see a man whose army just got whipped across half of Europe. Patton gestured toward the line of prisoners standing behind the colonel, the boys in their oversized coats, and the hollow faces, the men sitting in the mud beyond caring who watched them. You had tanks, planes, the entire apparatus, and here you are, standing in a wire cage in the rain, demanding to be addressed by your title. He paused. Something in the pause had weight, the way only true things do. That's not protocol, Colonel. That's a man who hasn't figured out what happened yet. Von Allenorf was not a stupid man. He understood with some cold and functional part of his mind that the arguments were going badly. He could feel the compound watching, 500 pairs of eyes, German and American, with the particular attention of people who have been waiting a long time for something to resolve. He was aware, on some level, he had not yet given permission to speak, and that the man standing in front of him had just driven through his entire army like a fist through paper. But there are things a man cannot concede, not because they are defensible, he was too intelligent for that comfort, but because they are structural. The load-bearing walls, the ones you do not touch because if they go, everything goes with them. 29 years. 29 years of rank being the realest thing in any room he entered. Of the oak leaves on his collar meaning something that transcended whichever army happened to be winning that particular month. The hierarchy was not a convenience. It was the architecture of a coherent world. Order ascending to order, each level answerable to the one above it, all of it pointing toward something permanent. And take that away, and you were left with what was outside this wire, mud and boys and burning cities and nothing that meant anything at all. If rank was nothing here, it was nothing anywhere. And if it was nothing anywhere, then the question he could not allow himself to ask, the one that had been pressing against the back of his skull since last Tuesday, would finally get through. He squared his shoulders. I will not be spoken to, he said, like a private soldier. The words hit the compound the way a stone hits still water, not loud, but spreading. Several German prisoners closed their eyes. An American corporal near the gate said something too quiet to carry. Castle, 2 steps behind the colonel's left shoulder, I wore the expression of a man watching a structure fall who cannot make himself look away and cannot make himself stay. Patton stared at him. Then, without warning, he laughed, short and sharp. Not warm, not cruel, but the genuine involuntary laugh of a man who has been surprised. He half-turned toward the MPs behind him. Did you boys hear that? One MP nodded with great care. Yes, sir. Patton faced von Allenorf again, and the laugh was gone. What replaced it was something simpler and considerably more final. He stepped forward, close enough that the rain dripping from his helmet brim fell between their boots. When he spoke, his voice had changed register entirely. Not louder, harder, the difference between wood and iron. Let me give you some protocol. He pointed toward the processing table by the gate. Every prisoner in this compound steps forward when an American soldier tells him to. Every one. He pointed briefly at himself. That includes generals. He looked directly at von Allenorf and did not look away. And it sure as hell includes lieutenant colonels. The silence that followed was the heaviest yet. And for the first time, the very first time since Patton had come through the gate, something shifted behind von Allenorf's eyes. Not surrender. Not yet. Something smaller and more honest. The first hairline fracture in a wall that had held for 29 years. He held his posture, but his next words came a half-second late. Patton did not give him those words. He simply looked at him very quietly and said, "Your country started the biggest war in human history. You lost. And right now, the only rank that matters in this cage is mine." Patton turned his head slightly. "Sergeant." Pruett was already moving. "Yes, sir. Process this man." "Yes, General." Von Allenorf did not move. The moment held. 3 seconds. 5. 10. The rain on the helmets along the wire had settled into a rhythm so steady and so soft that it had stopped registering as sound and become something closer to silence. The kind of silence that has texture to it, that you feel against your skin. Nobody in the compound spoke. Nobody shifted. Even the distant truck traffic on the road beyond the airfield seemed to have paused, as though the machinery of the war had briefly noticed what was happening inside this wire and held its breath. Then von Allenorf spoke. His voice was quieter than it had been, stripped of the formal cadence. Down to something more bare. But the quality was still there. Still that refusal to surrender the final inch. "I will not step forward," he said, "like cattle." Along the perimeter, several MPs adjusted their grip on their rifles. Not raising them, nothing so definitive as that. Just the small, unconscious tightening of hands that have run out of other things to do. Patton looked at him, and something in his expression completed itself, the way a door completes itself when it has finally, fully closed. "Son." The word was not unkind. It was simply the word a man reaches for when he is explaining something very fundamental to someone who should not require the explanation. "You are standing in a cage with 500 defeated soldiers and exactly 0 tanks." He pointed at the mud beneath von Allenorf's boots. And the gesture was unhurried, almost gentle. "If you don't start cooperating..." The voice dropped, not in volume but in register, to something that had the quality of bedrock, of a thing that does not negotiate because it has never needed to. "In about 5 seconds..." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "You are going to learn exactly how little patience I have left in this war." Then he went quiet. He did not count out loud. He simply looked at the man, and the 5 seconds materialized in the air between them as plainly as if he had spoken each one. The compound felt them. Every soldier in that enclosure, American and German alike, felt the seconds accumulating with the particular weight of time that is actually running out. 500 men held perfectly still, while what they were watching, what all of them understood they were watching, even the boys who had been pulled from school 6 months ago and had never read a philosophy text in their lives, was a man deciding whether the story he had been telling himself about who he was still had enough structural integrity to hold him upright, or whether it was, like everything else in that compound, simply waiting to come down. Von Allenorf looked around him, not the way he had been looking, the cataloging, the measured survey of a man who has already rendered his verdict on a room. This was different. This was involuntary. His eyes moved without his permission, from face to face, the way a man's eyes move when his body has understood something his mind is still negotiating. The prisoners. Hundreds of them. Boys from villages he had marched through, men pulled from factories that no longer existed, soldiers in uniforms that had been issued for a war that was now finished in every sense that counted. None of them looked at him with contempt. None of them looked at him with satisfaction. They looked at him with the quiet, exhausted patience of people who had already arrived at the destination and were simply waiting for him to catch up. The rifles along the wire. The American general in front of him, who had driven through his entire army without slowing down, and was now watching him with the particular stillness of a man who has more to do today than this and has already made room for it. And beyond the wire, the ruined hangars, the cratered road, the gray April sky over a country that had marched into Poland 6 years ago behind flags and music and the absolute conviction of its own permanence, and was now dissolving at the rate of 100 kilometers a week into something that had no name yet because it was still happening. The monocle came out. He removed it with his right hand, thumb and forefinger, the motion of 10,000 repetitions, as practiced and automatic as breathing. He held it for a moment. Just a moment. Then he slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat, and his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. And that was all. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. The American guards did not look at each other. The German prisoners watched the way they had watched everything since they came through the wire, with the profound, worn-down composure of men who have already done their grieving and come out the other side of it into something quieter. Pruett's voice was level. "Step forward, Colonel." Von Allenorf walked to the processing table. Behind him, Castle followed, and the relief on the young lieutenant's face was the most unguarded thing anyone had shown all morning. The processing took 4 minutes. Name, unit, weapons. The canvas sack, a wallet, a silver lighter with an inscription worn faint by handling, a folded map covered in pencil annotations that had described a front line which no longer existed, and last, placed in with the same care one uses for something irreplaceable, the monocle. The MP tied the sack and set it with the others. "With the officers," Pruett said and pointed. Von Allenorf started walking. Then, "Colonel." He stopped, turned. Patton came toward him one last time, the same unhurried stride, the same mud against the same polished boots. And they stood face to face in a compound that had returned in the space of 4 minutes to the ordinary business of ending a war. "You're not the first," Patton said. "German officer I've met who thought it would finish differently." He paused. "Most of them figured it out before the cage, but you held on to the idea that rank still meant something?" Von Allenorf's voice, when it came, was quieter than anything he had said all morning. "In my army," he said, "it did." Patton nodded. "I know." He let a beat pass. "That's the difference between our armies. In mine, rank means responsibility." He looked at the prisoners behind the officer, then back. "In yours, heck, it meant privilege." Von Allenorf said nothing. The arrogance was gone. Not broken exactly, but departed the way weather departs. What was left underneath it was simply exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for so long he had forgotten it was weight, and has only just now been allowed to set it down. Patton turned away. "Keep processing," he said to Pruett, and walked toward the gate. At the perimeter, he stopped once and looked back. Across the compound, Friedrich von Allenorf stood among the other captured officers. No monocle, no demands, no architecture of rank held up against the world. Just a man in a gray coat in the mud, waiting for whatever came next. Patton gave a small nod to no one in particular and stepped through the gate. It closed behind him. The rain kept falling. A new column of Germans was already coming in from the road. The war rolled on, but it was almost done.